Hi everyone. Welcome to our second day of our journey through the book of Galatians this week. Yesterday we heard from Paul some broad detail as to what is happening in the church in Galatia. That the true gospel of God, preached to them by Paul, is being changed and perverted by some men from Jerusalem. The details of which he is yet to dig into, but his point is clear. Any gospel that is not from God is not good news at all, and will lead people away from God. He pleads with the Galatians to come back to his original teaching. Today, as we look at the second half of chapter 2, we will see conflict between Paul and Peter, which is reflective of the situation in Galatia, even though the interaction happened elsewhere. Paul tells us of a time when Peter changed his behaviour in response to some men arriving from Jerusalem, which should sound familiar to us. Paul writes in verses 11 to 13, "When Cephas, Peter, came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles, because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. The other Jews joined him in his hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy even Barnabas was led astray." Now Peter had been living according to the true gospel, the good news that tells us that through Jesus' death and resurrection, there is no longer a divide between Jew and Gentile. They are now the same before God. And so it is perfectly right to eat with Gentiles, because they are brothers in Christ now. However, Peter obviously knows that the men who have come from Jerusalem don't think that is correct. They are from the circumcision group. It would be fair to say that these men believe in Jesus' death and resurrection, but they believe that to be a true follower of God, you would still need to follow the law, which includes circumcision. So for a Gentile believer to be a true follower, they would need to follow the law to the letter. Well, Paul continues in verse 14 onwards. "When I saw that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas in front of them all, 'You are a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile and not like a Jew. How is it then that you force Gentiles to follow Jewish customs? We who are Jews by birth and not sinful Gentiles know that a person is not justified by the works of the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ. So we too have put our faith in Christ Jesus, that we may be justified by faith in Christ and not by the works of the law, because by the works of the law no one will be justified.'" These men from Jerusalem are attempting to force the Gentiles into a works-based salvation. But Paul knows that it is enough to be saved by faith alone. The works of the law do not justify a person, but justification comes through faith. So forcing Gentiles to follow Jewish customs does them no good. Indeed, it does them serious harm. Not only does it force them to follow laws that require them to do works, it takes them away from the true gospel of God, and for no good reason. By the works of the law, no one will be justified. So why are they forcing the Gentiles to live in this way? Well, it is because these men have not understood properly the true gospel. They do not understand that the law has been fulfilled and grace now reigns supreme. The gospel that saves Gentiles saves Jews too, if they understand what Jesus has done for them. This is the exact situation that the Galatian church finds themselves in. They are being told by men from Jerusalem, that it is not enough to just have faith in Jesus. They need to also follow the law to be saved. And Paul's concluding statement is an emphatic full stop on the argument. We read this in verses 19 to 21. For through the law I died to the law, so that I might live for God. I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. I do not set aside the grace of God, for if righteousness could be gained through the law, Christ died for nothing. The life that Paul now lives is not one bound by the law, but rather free in the grace of God, given through the death of Jesus. And Paul will go into much greater detail in the next chapter about the law, but what the Galatian church needs to hear, and we do too, is in verse 21. If righteousness could be gained through the law, Christ died for nothing. Paul is going to show us in great detail the purpose of the law, what it can and can't do. But this point here is essential to his line of argument. Works of the law do not replace what God achieved through Jesus' death and resurrection. His sacrifice for sin, once for all, could not be achieved any other way, and certainly not by following the law. And so Paul lives by faith in the Son of God, who loved him and gave himself for him. He lives a life that serves God in all that he does. And we know of all that Paul did in his lifetime in the name of God. As we reflect on this passage today, I wonder how you will react to this news, to this clarification of the gospel. There is wonderful news to be found here, that we are saved by faith and not by works, that we do not have to follow the law in order to be justified by God, which does not do away with doing good works in our lives, or not at all. But our good works do not gain our salvation. Perhaps as you look at your life, you might see some works as a key part of your understanding of being saved, that you feel required to live in this way to please God. But is that what our passage is telling us? The short answer is no. Paul is reminding us that our good works, whilst good to do, are not the things that save us or have any bearing on our salvation. Because if they did, then Christ's death counts for nothing. That sacrifice for the sins of the world actually didn't work, and we still need to prove to God that we're good enough to be saved. Which, of course, we aren't. And we could never be. And we can thank God that this is not the way that he sees us. We now live in Christ by faith. We have died to the law so that we can live for God. So today I encourage you to think about that. And think about what your life would look like if you lived that way. What does it look like to live for God? To know that it is only through faith that you have been saved, and not through any works you might do. Perhaps it'll change how you look at the things you do each week, or how you relate to others at church or in your local community. The good news that Jesus has done everything required for us to be saved is so wonderful and life-changing that once you understand it fully, your life will never be the same again. I pray that today this good news will bring you joy as you pray to God to continue to change your heart to be more like Christ.